The old man was handcuffed for stealing a loaf of bread. No one looked twice at the worn army backpack he clutched like a lifeline. Inside that backpack, officers found a faded military ID tag, an old wedding ring, and a letter yellowed with time, unsent. The next morning, in a nearly empty courtroom, the judge read his name and suddenly stood up, hands trembling, eyes flooded with tears. The old man looked down. He wasn't surprised. He knew what was coming. He sat hunched near the steam grate outside a shuttered deli in Brooklyn, invisible to most. The early morning wind carried a bitter chill slicing through threadbare layers that had long stopped pretending to offer warmth. Beneath a knit cap pulled low and a beard left wild by years of indifference, his eyes remained hidden, watchful but uninterested, unmoving. In his lap sat an old military backpack, faded olive-green canvas, peeling at the seams, straps nearly split through with time. He clutched it like it was the last thing anchoring him to the earth. Because it was. His name was Samuel Morgan. Most people just called him that quiet old guy near the corner. Few knew his full name. Fewer still knew that Sam Morgan had once served in the U.S. Army for 20 years, 3 tours overseas, and a Bronze Star. That part of his life lived only inside that backpack. Sam was 67 now, homeless for over a decade, a ghost in a city that never stopped moving. Each morning was a silent ritual. He would unzip the top flap of the backpack, fingers moving with surprising care, and check its contents. Not for food, not for cash, but for a folded yellowed envelope, edges softened by age, and the rub of cloth against cloth. There was no address on it, just a single letter written in delicate cursive on the front, M. He never read it. He didn't need to. He'd written every word with a shaking hand over 15 winters ago and never sent it. He didn't even know where to send it. Margaret had been gone before the ink was fully dry. The letter remained, tucked beneath a tarnished wedding ring wrapped in a scrap of flannel. That ring had once rested on her finger. Now it lived inside a bag no one dared touch. Sam didn't beg. He didn't talk. He avoided eye contact and kept his world narrowed to steps and sidewalks. When a bakery worker handed him a half-stale croissant without speaking, he gave a single nod in return. That was enough. He moved from place to place, never the same corner 2 nights in a row. Not because of police or trouble, but because he didn't want to overstay his welcome, even when he wasn't welcome in the first place. People didn't notice him. That was fine. The less they saw, the less they'd ask. And questions were dangerous when you had no answers left to give. To most, Sam Morgan was just another aging drifter, holding on to an old bag and a forgotten past. But inside that torn canvas, beneath the rusted zipper and broken strap, was a life once lived with honor, love, and sacrifice, and a name the world had stopped saying. But not for long. The wind that night was merciless, sharp as glass, and colder than regret. The city shimmered with frost, every surface glazed in a sheen of white. New York's heartbeat had slowed under the weight of winter, but hunger didn't pause. Not even in the coldest hour. Sam's stomach had been empty for 3 days. He had tried to ignore it, tried sipping water to fool. It tried lying still for hours to make the pain fade. But hunger, real hunger, has a voice of its own. It grows louder in the dark. It claws at the spine. And when it speaks, it doesn't ask permission. Just before midnight, Sam passed by Martino's grocery. The lights were dim inside. He paused under the awning, his breath curling in the air. He knew the place. Mr. Martino had run it for over 20 years. Sam had once helped unload a delivery truck for him during a blackout. No one remembered that now. Inside, a single loaf of bread sat on the discount rack, yesterday's batch half-cracked, wrapped in thin plastic. The shop was quiet. Mr. Martino stood behind the register, back turned restocking cigarettes. Sam stepped inside, slow, deliberate. The door jingled softly. He didn't ask for anything. His fingers trembled as he reached under his coat. He took the loaf and slipped it beneath the worn fabric. A whisper of plastic. A breath held. Then, hey, Mr. Martino turned, eyes narrowing. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop right there." Sam froze. He didn't run. The loaf was still visible, pressed under his half-zipped jacket. He didn't try to hide it. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said, almost inaudibly. But Martino was already dialing. "I'm calling the cops. You've been hanging around too much. I'm done being nice." The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers, one older, one younger. The younger officer, Diaz, stepped forward first. Sam didn't resist. He simply raised his hands as Diaz reached for the cuffs. Sir Diaz hesitated. "We've got to take you in." Sam nodded, wordless. The cold metal bit into his wrists. As Diaz tightened the cuffs, Sam's backpack slipped from his shoulder and dropped onto the tiled floor with a soft thud. It spilled open. The older officer knelt to gather the contents. What fell out wasn't a weapon nor a wallet. It was a folded envelope, weathered and yellow. The letter to M.A. Chain with a military ID tag, letters almost unreadable from decades of wear, and a wedding ring wrapped in what looked like an old flannel handkerchief sealed in a clear plastic bag. The officer stared for a moment, then silently put everything back inside the backpack. "You a veteran?" Diaz asked, noticing the tag. Sam didn't answer at first. Then finally, "Used to be." Martino stood behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes still sharp with judgment. He's stolen before Martino snapped. Always hanging around, always suspicious. This isn't the first time. Sam kept his gaze on the floor. Officer Diaz sighed. "We'll take it from here." As they led Sam out into the bitter night, no one asked where he'd been sleeping. No one asked about the scar on his wrist, or the limp in his left leg, or why a man who once wore a uniform was now stealing bread just to survive the next sunrise. They only saw what was in his hands, not what had been in his life. The next morning, the courtroom was as cold as the streets outside. The radiators clicked half-heartedly, failing to thaw the air or the mood. A scattering of public defenders whispered over their folders. A court clerk shuffled papers. A bailiff scrolled through his phone. Samuel Edward Morgan sat alone at the defendant's table. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. A frayed army coat, zipped halfway, sleeves too short, and his boots, once military issue, held together by duct tape and dry hope. No one sat in the gallery for him. No family, no friends, no one who knew his name. He didn't look up. The court-appointed attorney assigned to his case was late. Even if he had shown up, it wouldn't have mattered, just another name on a docket, just another petty theft in a city drowning in them. Case 37192, State of New York versus Samuel Edward Morgan, the clerk announced flatly. At the bench sat Judge Michael Carmichael, known for being efficient, direct, and uninterested in stories. A former military medic turned law graduate, he carried himself with formality and control. He had presided over thousands of cases, rarely surprised, never shaken. The young prosecutor adjusted his tie and spoke without looking at Sam. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread. Given his repeat offenses and transient status, we request he remain in custody until trial. No known residence, no employment history. We consider him a flight risk." Judge Carmichael scanned the case file. Routine. He didn't look up as he asked Mr. Morgan, "How do you plead?" Sam's voice was dry but steady. "Guilty, Your Honor." "I was hungry." A muffled chuckle came from the back row. The bailiff didn't react. Neither did the court reporter. Just another day. Then the judge's brow furrowed. His eyes had fallen on a specific line in the report, full legal name, Samuel Edward Morgan. He said it again, but slower this time aloud. Samuel Edward Morgan. His hand paused. Then, without a word, Judge Carmichael stood. The courtroom fell silent. Judges don't stand during minor hearings. They certainly don't freeze in place, staring at a man accused of stealing bread. Sam looked up, just briefly. He met the judge's gaze, then gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. Then he looked down again. He knew. Judge Carmichael's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. After several long seconds, he cleared his throat, voice rough. This court will recess for 15 minutes. He turned and disappeared into his chambers. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sam didn't move. Inside his chambers, Carmichael closed the door behind him and locked it. His hands trembled as he walked to his desk. He opened the top drawer and pulled out a photograph bent at the corners, colors faded with time. A younger man in dusty fatigues stared back at him from the image himself, nearly 20 years ago, standing with a medical unit in Fallujah. Faces lined up in rows, some smiling, some not. He found him. In the back row. Taller than most. Broader shoulders. A distinct scar just above the brow. Sam Morgan. But what hit Carmichael hardest wasn't the photo, it was the memory. That day. That chaos. That voice shouting through smoke, "Keep breathing, kid. You're not dying here." Carmichael had been 19. A medic fresh in the field, covered in someone else's blood, trying to hold his insides together. He remembered being lifted, carried, for miles, through gunfire and dust and flame. The man refused to stop, took shrapnel in his leg, wouldn't accept help until Carmichael was safe. He thought the man had died. He never knew his full name. Only Grady, no, not Grady. That was someone else. The real one. The one who saved him was Morgan. Samuel Edward Morgan. The judge touched the scar on his own shoulder, still faint, but always there. His hand stayed there as he stared back down at the photo. 20 years. And the man who'd carried him out of death was now facing jail for stealing a loaf of bread. Justice had forgotten him. But not for long. Judge Carmichael didn't return to the bench immediately after the recess. He stayed in his chambers, surrounded by silence and faded memories, piecing together fragments of a life that had once saved his own. He logged into the secure Veterans Affairs portal, a privilege he still had access to through his pro bono work with veteran legal outreach. He typed the name slowly, Samuel Edward Morgan. The file populated instantly. Service record, deployment logs, awards. He read the summary aloud, his voice nearly breaking. Staff Sergeant, United States Army. 20 years of active duty. 3 tours, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Logistics Specialist. Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart, for injuries sustained during combat. Commended for heroic actions under fire. Fallujah 2003 led the evacuation of wounded soldiers during an ambush, personally rescued 17 individuals while under sustained fire. It went on listing citations, letters of recommendation, mentions in old military publications. Then abrupt silence in the timeline. No forwarding address, no retirement interview, no transition counseling. Just gone. Discharged honorably in 2004. And then, disappearance. Carmichael leaned back in his chair, hand still on the mouse, eyes glazed over, with a memory that had refused to surface until now. He remembered the heat, the smoke, the sound of his own breath collapsing into panic, and one voice cutting through it all. Keep breathing, kid. That kid had grown up, put on a robe, sat on a bench, and forgotten the name of the man who carried him 2 miles through hell. Until now. He opened the subfolder labeled Medical Exceptions. There it was. Margaret Morgan, spouse of Staff Sergeant Morgan. Diagnosed in early 2008 with late-stage cancer. Multiple notes from physicians requesting expedited testing, delayed by paperwork backlogs, and TRICARE verification failures. By the time she was properly diagnosed, it was too late. She died 6 weeks later. Sam had appealed. Twice. Then he stopped. One final note from 2009, claimant unresponsive to correspondence. Benefits suspended due to inactivity. There was no mention of where he went. No notes from VA outreach, no flagged alerts, just silence. Carmichael felt the anger rise in his chest, not at Sam, but at the system, the indifference, the bureaucracy that reduced a war hero to a case file with a checkbox marked inactive. Sam hadn't vanished because he wanted to disappear. He'd vanished because grief had nowhere else to go. His whole life had revolved around service to his country, to his unit, and above all, to Margaret. When the system failed her, it failed him too, and he never forgave it. He had given them his spine, his lungs, his sleep. They took his heart and gave him forms to fill out. He stopped filling them. He took his pension and donated every cent to Margaret's favorite hospice, sold their tiny apartment, burned everything that tied him to who he used to be, except the backpack. That backpack was all that remained. The letter, the ring, the photo. Carmichael stared at the screen at the photo embedded in the file. Sam Younger carrying a wounded child to a medevac helicopter during a humanitarian mission in Kandahar. His face, stern, focused, shoulders squared. The man he remembered. Now that same man had stood before him in court, with shaking hands and a loaf of stolen bread under his coat. Invisible. Forgotten. But no more. Carmichael stood slowly, the weight of both memory and guilt pressing against his chest. The law had its limits, but honor didn't. The next morning, the courtroom was almost unrecognizable. The usual empty benches were now filled. Uniforms lined the rows, polished boots silent against the floor. Local reporters stood in the back, cameras respectfully lowered. 3 officers in full dress blues sat upright behind the prosecution's table. And at the far end of the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap, sat a woman in her 30s. Her eyes were rimmed red, but steady. Rebecca, Margaret's niece. In her hands, carefully held, as if it might dissolve into dust, was the letter marked A. M. Sam entered through the side door, escorted by the bailiff. His steps were slower today. Not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of all the eyes suddenly on him. He'd never seen this many people gathered for him, certainly not since his wedding day. He didn't meet their gaze. His court-appointed attorney was gone, replaced by a man with silver hair and a veteran's lapel pin. Richard Harlow, a senior counsel from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. He leaned toward Sam as he sat down and whispered, "We're here for you, Sergeant Morgan." Sergeant. It had been years since anyone had called him that. All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Carmichael. The room stood. The judge entered not with the distant air of yesterday, but with a kind of quiet gravity that filled the space without a sound. Before we address the charges before this court, he began, voice steady but softer than usual. We will hear testimony relevant to the defendant's background. He nodded toward the stand. Colonel James Mason took the oath. He was every inch the soldier back, straight voice, commanding eyes unwavering. I am Colonel James Mason, United States Army, stationed at Fort Hamilton. I served with Staff Sergeant Samuel Morgan during our deployment to Iraq in 2003. He turned facing Sam directly. This man saved my life, and the lives of 17 others. The courtroom shifted, breath held. During an ambush near Fallujah, our convoy came under heavy fire. A fuel truck was hit. Flames everywhere. Sergeant Morgan, though already wounded, drove that burning vehicle away from the rest of us to prevent an explosion. He sustained second-degree burns to his hands and arms. The colonel's voice cracked slightly. He refused treatment, carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire. One of them was a 19-year-old field medic with shrapnel in his gut. He carried him over 2 miles on foot. That medic was Private First Class Michael Carmichael. A collective inhale swept the room. All eyes turned to the judge. Carmichael removed his glasses. His voice trembled. I never knew his full name. I only heard Morgan shouted above gunfire. I spent years trying to find him. When I saw him in court yesterday, I didn't recognize his face, but my body remembered. He placed his hand on his shoulder over the scar. I survived because of him. I became a judge because of him. Because he didn't leave me behind. A long silence followed. Then Colonel Mason resumed. After returning stateside, Sergeant Morgan's wife, Margaret, became seriously ill. Her diagnosis was delayed due to processing issues with TRICARE. She passed shortly after. He appealed for support, twice. The system failed him both times. The colonel lifted a folder. Due to a clerical error, all of Staff Sergeant Morgan's VA benefits were suspended 15 years ago. He never received a cent of what he was owed housing, medical care, pensions, none of it. He turned to the judge. Over $246,000 in back pay. Lost. Until now. Sam sat motionless. Rebecca stood still holding the letter. She stepped forward, trembling. I used to write him every year, she said softly. Every Veterans Day, every Christmas. I never got a reply. I thought, maybe he didn't want to be found. She looked at Sam. But you kept my aunt's letter. That means you never let go. Her voice cracked. I never stopped looking for you. The judge cleared his throat again, then addressed the courtroom. In light of these extraordinary circumstances and the failure of multiple institutions to uphold their duty to a man who served with honor, he looked directly at the prosecutor. Does the state wish to proceed with charges? The young prosecutor stood visibly moved. No, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss all charges with prejudice. So ordered. The gavel came down not in condemnation, but in redemption. Carmichael removed his glasses again. He looked at Sam not as a defendant, but as a man he once owed his life to. This court owes you more than an apology, he said, voice thick. It owes you your name back. Sam didn't speak. He just nodded. And for the first time in years, his eyes met the world again. The dismissal of charges against Samuel Morgan didn't just close a courtroom file. It cracked something open in the city's conscience. That same afternoon, Judge Carmichael held a rare press conference outside the courthouse steps. Standing beside him were Colonel Mason Rebecca and Richard Harlow. Carmichael, still in his robe, addressed the small crowd of reporters and the growing group of veterans who had gathered after hearing the news. This court apologizes not just for the arrest of Sergeant Morgan, he said, pausing to steady his voice, but for the years of silence that followed his service. Silence is not justice. Ignorance is not an excuse. Within hours, the story had gone viral. Photos of Sam, one from the courtroom and one from 20 years earlier, carrying a wounded soldier across a battlefield, spread across social media. Comment threads flooded with stories of veterans who had faced similar injustices. Local news stations ran back-to-back coverage. Even national outlets picked up the headline, Forgotten Hero Found, in courtroom judge stands for homeless veteran who once saved his life. The public response was swift. By the end of the week, the Morgan Fund was established by the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, seeded by private donations and grants. its mission to identify, support, and legally represent homeless veterans who had fallen through administrative cracks. Among the first to donate was Mr. Martino. He didn't say much, just waited outside Veterans Haven one evening, loaf of fresh bread in hand, and an envelope marked "For Morgan Fund." Taped to the bread bag was a handwritten note, "Fresh bread. No need to return the favor." Earlier that week, Martino had been watching the news when a photo flashed across the screen, an old grainy shot of a soldier unloading crates during a blackout decades ago. His jaw clenched. That soldier had once helped him during a flood, no questions asked. Now he knew why the face looked familiar. "I misjudged him," he said quietly to Rebecca, who happened to be visiting. "Thought he was just another problem." Rebecca didn't scold, she just nodded. So did we all. Meanwhile, the Department of Veterans Affairs responded to public outcry by launching an internal audit. A spokesperson confirmed that they would re-examine all terminated benefit cases from the past 2 decades where service members failed to respond due to homelessness, medical conditions, or bereavement. They didn't call it the Morgan Protocol, but many did. Across the country, VA clinics saw a spike in walk-ins, older veterans encouraged by Sam's story. Some came with hope. Others just wanted to know someone still remembered their name. In Brooklyn, Sam remained mostly quiet. He never asked for a platform, and he never gave interviews. But in his silence, the city finally heard him and began to listen for others like him. Samuel Morgan moved into Veterans Haven on a cloudy Tuesday morning. It wasn't much a single-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, the hallway walls lined with faded unit flags and framed black and white photos of men who had once stood tall in uniform, now quietly aging under one roof. But for Sam, it was home. For the first time in over 15 years, he had a key in his pocket, a bed with clean sheets, a door that locked from the inside, not the street. Inside his small room, he didn't hang much, just 3 things. A photo of Margaret smiling in a sun hat on their anniversary trip to Maine. The letter marked M placed behind glass, but left unopened. And his medal's faded ribbons, and a bronze star mounted in a modest shadow box he built himself from scraps. He didn't touch them often, but one morning, as soft light spilled through the blinds, he sat on the edge of his bed and reached for the uniform folded at the back of his closet. The fabric was stiff, unused for decades. A musty scent rose as he unfolded the jacket, the dry, buried smell of time and memory. For a moment, he was back there, the dust, the sweat, the scream of helicopters above. He reached for the belt and paused, then wordlessly punched a new hole, his waist, narrower now, hollowed by years of quiet hunger. As he slipped it on his shoulders, drooped under its weight. The sleeves hung long, the waistline sagged loose. Time had taken his mass, but not his pride. He stood in front of the mirror, straightening his posture, then gently placed a hand over his heart, just above the medals. That afternoon, he spoke at a local high school. He didn't speak like a hero. He didn't need to. His voice was quiet, but unflinching. "I don't need money," he told the students who sat silent and wide-eyed. "I just want to be remembered. By my name." He didn't ask them to thank him. He asked them to see. Veterans Day arrived with a crisp sky and the kind of autumn breeze that rustles flags just enough to make them whisper. At Fort Hamilton, a podium had been placed on the main lawn. Rows of folding chairs were filled with service members, retirees, local families, and students from a nearby middle school. The American flag hung heavy and full behind the stage, as if even the fabric itself understood the weight of the day. Among the list of speakers, some generals, some politicians. One name stood quietly near the end, Samuel E. Morgan. When his name was called, there was a pause. Not because anyone doubted who he was, but because everyone knew exactly what it meant for him to be there. He stepped up slowly, his dress uniform loose on his thinner frame. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight not in gleam, but in quiet echo. He stood still, looked out over the crowd, then spoke without notes. "I once protected this country," he began, voice measured. "Today the country has protected me back." No applause, just stillness. He let the silence linger. "Kindness," he said, "is never late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." He didn't say much else. He didn't need to. The audience rose not in cheers, but in a silent salute. That same week, a 12-year-old boy submitted an essay for his school's annual Veterans Day contest. In it, he wrote, "Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead." He won first place. The essay was later read aloud at a Brooklyn City Council meeting on homelessness policy. Outside the Brooklyn Municipal Courthouse, where Sam had once stood alone at a defendant's table, a new plaque was installed in bronze. It bore no portrait, no headline, just a simple inscription: "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." Beneath it, a small sculpted relief. A soldier carrying another through battlefield, smoke the younger man's hand clutching the older man's collar. The older man's face set in quiet resolve. The names were not engraved, but those who knew, knew. As Sam passed the plaque one morning, the sun caught the bronze just right, casting a faint reflection of his silhouette over the engraved soldier. For a fleeting second, past and present merged. The city had seen him. Finally. Sam never returned to the spotlight after that. He declined further interviews, politely refused book deals. When asked by a reporter why he didn't want to share more of his story, he simply replied, "I already did. I lived it." Most afternoons, he could be found in Prospect Park sitting on a bench near the playground. The same bench he used to sleep beneath on winter nights, when the world had forgotten his name. Now children played nearby. Parents waved at him. Some nodded. Some didn't know who he was. That was fine. One afternoon, a younger veteran, maybe in his 30s, sat down quietly beside him. Said nothing, just placed a steaming cup of coffee on the bench between them. Sam didn't ask who he was. He simply nodded. Some bonds need no introductions. Sam didn't need everyone to remember his story, just enough people to keep it alive. In the end, the man who once vanished into silence had become something far greater. A legacy carried not in words, but in the quiet shift of a city learning to look twice.